This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by the New Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Toll of Its Military Machine by Norman Solomon. From Iraq through Afghanistan and Syria, and on to little-known deployments in a range of countries around the globe, the United States has been at perpetual war for at least the past 2 decades. 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan set into motion a hugely consequential shift in America's foreign policy, a constant state of war that is almost entirely invisible to the American public. War Made Invisible by the journalist and political analyst Norman Solomon exposes how this happened and what its consequences are, from military and civilian casualties to drained resources at home. Necessary, timely, and unflinching, War Made Invisible by Norman Solomon is available now from the New Press. Order your copy wherever books are sold. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Behold, a new American industrial policy. Behold, Bidenomics. The Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. The proclaimed goals of Bidenomics are to speed a green energy transition to confront climate change, revive American manufacturing and union density, and check China's economic and military power. President Biden recently described this economic agenda as a, quote, fundamental break from the economic theory that has failed America's middle class for decades now, trickle-down economics. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan criticized, quote, a set of ideas that champion tax cutting and deregulation, privatization over public action, and trade liberalization as an end in itself, synthesized in the belief, quote, that markets always allocate capital productively and efficiently. The Biden administration, in other words, has been forthrightly repudiating neoliberalism, at least on the level of rhetoric. Reviving working class power and confronting climate change are, of course, critical goals. But there is a lot of debate on the left as to whether Bidenomics will help accomplish them, and as to whether, or to what degree, this is indeed a new political economic paradigm that makes a sharp break with neoliberalism. There's also serious concern over the way that this new industrial policy is so deeply wrapped up in a new Cold War with China, an attempt to not only check China's geopolitical ambitions, but their economic development as well. And lastly, there's the big question of where this leaves the entirety of the global South. Whatever's going on, a remarkably new landscape for political and economic struggle is taking shape, and it's critical that we understand it. Today's episode defines and debates Bidenomics with Daniela Gabor, Ted Fertik, and Tim Sahay. Before we get rolling, whether you're a graduate student, a letter carrier, a union organizer, or a librarian, or whatever else you are up to, where else, aside from The Dig, can you get this sort of in-depth critical analysis of everything pumped into your earbuds or car speaker? I love meeting Dig listeners because all of you, or I mean most, the vast majority of you, whatever, I haven't met all you, you're so smart, interesting, engaged in incredibly important work to change this world, all over the world. In the US, UK, Mexico, India, Brazil, all over the place. I also really appreciate that listeners just like you make this podcast possible by making a monthly contribution at patreon.com/thedig. This is overwhelmingly a listener-supported operation, and it's your donations that make it possible for us to put out every episode with no paywall, free, so that everyone can listen, regardless of your ability to pay. If you can afford to pay and you haven't yet done so, please do pay up now. Put an end to free riding. Contribute at patreon.com/thedig. Also, if you do so, you get our newsletter in your email inbox. It's a really great newsletter. For donations of $10 or more a month, you will get a book or books in the mail, a Dig tote bag, or a Dig mug. Listeners outside the U.S. can receive ebooks instead. That's patreon.com/thedig. Please make my day. Contribute to this podcast's long-term viability. Hit pause. Click now to to contribute. A reminder that in July and August, we are on summer schedule, which will mean roughly 1 to 2 fewer digs a month. If you think you've run out of digs, you probably have not run out of digs. Peruse our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Okay, here's Daniela Gabor, Ted Fertik, and Tim Sahay. Daniela Gabor is professor of economics and microfinance at University of the West of England, Bristol. She studies development, money, and debt through a critical microfinance lens. Ted Fertik is a historian and senior strategist for policy and research at the Working Families Party. All opinions expressed are his own. Tim Sahay is the co-editor of The Poly Crisis, a publication in partnership with Phenomenal World, focusing on the domestic and international political economy of climate. Daniela Gabor, Ted Fertik, and Tim Sahay. Welcome to The Dig.
Hello.
Great to be here.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Let's start with Bidenomics. It was a term I think first coined by outside observers, but now very much embraced by the Biden administration. What is Bidenomics, and what does it have to do with industrial policy?
So at least three aspects to it that we could talk about, I think, and speaking here probably from the perspective of the administration itself and the authors of Bidenomics. Not that I'm one of them, but what they would say. So I think there's a distributional aspect to it. They like to talk a lot about building the economy from the bottom up and the middle out, as opposed to the top down, a sort of explicit rejection of trickle down as a theory of economic life and of governing a capitalist economy. There's a lot about sectoral aspects of the economy, and I think that's the real industrial policy dimension. And there's a real emphasis, it's maybe the third most emphasized of the three, around questions of place. And so they are not indifferent to where things are made, and that is where in a global sense, but also where in a domestic sense. So with a lot of concern for communities that bore the brunt of deindustrialization. So those are three attributes or three considerations that I think have gone into the making of Bidenomics. And then obviously we can talk a lot about the particular components of it, the particular mechanisms that are being used to try to achieve each of those goals.
Yeah, so Bidenomics is principally a new legislative and macroeconomic policy mix by Democratic Party elites to contain the threat of Trumpism. It's their answer to the question Social Democrats ask the world over: why can't the center hold? So their diagnosis is that economic and political polarization was created by the winner-takes-all sort of low investment, low growth, neoliberal policy mix. And that mix left people behind. The gap between those without college degrees and those with college degrees widened. That's the class component. And it left regions behind. So the gap between super zips and suburban rural areas also widened. And that created political instability. So they now want to reverse these trends actively by pursuing, legislative investment-based agenda to restore broad-based growth. So when they regained control of Congress, they pursued, what's been called the big fiscal program to put money into people's pockets and increase the sum of public and private investment in the country. Bidenomics also has this macroeconomic component of running a hot labor market, with the Fed targeting full employment and, risking inflation going above the 2% target. And together, these things created a high pressure economy that has created upward mobility for people at the back of the labor queue. And that all those gaps between black and white unemployment rates and wage growth for those without college degrees and with college degrees has narrowed dramatically. And, and then the question of how did they actually do this? How do you design these spending packages with these goals in mind once you have one governing power, which the Democrats did? In 2020, the Democratic Congress then passed a series of bills that uses policy tools that explicitly directs dollars to reverse those class, place, and race inequalities. And what are these policy provisions? They are Buy American, Make in America requirements. There are subsidies for manufacturers. There are federal loan guarantees for green projects. There are these kind of place-based incentives, and also a large amount of public R&D to boost future growth. It also includes plugging, the terribly patchy welfare system with earned income tax credits, with unemployment insurance, SNAP expansion, etc. And all of this has been sort of paired with pro-labor provisions to increase union power and union density. And when these spending packages have been designed, they've been designed to preferentially create jobs for non-college educated people. So then Bidenomics has this question of, how do you actually pay for it? Do you tax? Do you borrow? And there they've kind of come down on progressive tax the rich packages and closing of tax loopholes, that Fortune 500 companies have exploited. And this component of Bidenomics should not be forgotten. The different factions of the Democratic Party, the Wall Street and Silicon Valley friendly centrists and the progressive factions, they've had a real slugfest in Congress over raising revenue. And that slugfest has reduced the size of all of these spending packages and left behind whole swathes of issue areas. Childcare, pre-K, schools, public housing, public transit. So Bidenomics has been hugely contested and shaped by those thin congressional majorities that it was trying to fix.
That legislation passed with the trifecta. There were three key legislative aspects to Bidenomics: the Infrastructure Act of 2021, and then the CHIPS and Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, which were both passed in 2022. Tim and Ted, what does this bundle of legislation do from a bird's eye view? Because we'll get into a lot of detail later. What does it do to expand productive capacity in particular sectors and specifically to drive the green energy transition? And then how do the three pieces of legislation fit together if they indeed do? Lachlan Carey and June Ukita Shepard argue that CHIPS is the brain, infrastructure is the backbone, and the IRA is the engine. Is it really all that coherent? And then we'll move on to Daniela's critique.
I think that is a good metaphor. I don't think it was particularly coherent in setting together and splitting up the bills in this way. Was sort of active decisions that the Biden White House and Senators Schumer and Pelosi in the House had to actively make about exactly what goes into each bill. And that was a continuous negotiation with a lot of scrambling, but I think like the coherence of it is right. Like calling the CHIPS and Science Act the brains of the operation kind of makes sense because it is about improving research and development and pouring money into the entire alphabet soup of American science, technology, medicine, biotech. All of the agencies that do R&D got money, and again, those agencies have research institutes, National Institutes of Health, etc., spread across the country. They're not just located in the high-tech clusters around Cambridge, Massachusetts, around Silicon Valley. They are really spread around the country, and therefore they would help reverse polarization by bringing innovation and productivity to other clusters across the country. So that's kind of like the brains of the operation. And then the infrastructure, the Investment and Jobs Act, is the backbone in the sense that it is about creating the grid, for example. So it has, about $60 or $70 billion to help modernize the grid, which has fallen into a state of disrepair and cannot take on the huge amount of renewable energy that we need to install. And it is also about the backbone of the digital ecosystem. So it's about the broadband, bringing broadband to the masses, in particular rural broadband, which were, again, connecting left behind communities into the modern sort of information age and enabling sort of skilled work to happen skilled digital work to happen in places that currently don't have broadband. So between the broadband and the grid, it is the backbone of the operation. But, the backbone doesn't really work without the IRA engine, which is this enormous artillery of public finance, of loans and grants and tax credits that actually build out this renewable energy system and is the driver of manufacturing growth. And so in that sense, these three pieces sort of fit together. Legislatively speaking, they were split up. Progressives in the US Congress did not want them to be split up because then they would lose leverage. And they had sort of characteristically the CHIPS and Science Act is bipartisan. The IIJA Act, the Investment and Jobs Act, is also bipartisan. So those are things the Democratic Party and at least 10 Republican senators could agree on. And then the IRA is the only sort of partisan bill. It's the only Democrats' only bill. And that allows for a much broader set of social and economic objectives to be put into that bill. So they have different logics, different political logics of putting them together.
Just to add a couple of things. So one is that I do think that it's worth, and certainly the Biden sort of spokespeople would say that the American Rescue Plan, so the bill that was passed,
ARPA,
right, on pure party line vote in March 2021, counts as the fourth of the Bidenomics bills. And that one speaks to some of the things that have been perhaps less emphasized in recent debates, but the idea of running the economy hot, right, of just using straight up fiscal power to juice aggregate demand. That was certainly an element of the thinking behind ARPA, as well as some of the more sort of welfarist components of at least what Bidenomics aspired to be. And probably we'll talk later on about what was shorn from what ultimately became the IRA. But I think famously things like the child tax credit were a key part of ARPA, and that was some Democrats, and not even necessarily the most left-wing Democrats, trying to seize the opportunity of a moment where some kind of welfare spending seemed to command a pretty broad assent to engineer some structural changes to the U.S. welfare state. But the other thing I wanted to just add to what Tim says, and hopefully this can help frame some of the broader discussion, is that I think that part of the coherence of the bills that you mentioned can be found in understanding the joint set of problems that they're meant to address. And in the talk that Tim and I gave a couple of months ago, we laid it out as a sort of triangle in terms of the question of what China's rise means for the United States, means for the U.S. economy, and means for U.S. so-called global leadership. The question of the U.S. political system and the sort of intertwined questions of inequality, populism, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, climate, right? And then all of these three terms intersect and interact in some really interesting and important ways. But all three of those bills, and not in a one way, I think each of them contains pieces that are addressed to one or several of those sort of desiderata. But that's the challenge. And I do think the coherence can be found in the fact that one way or another, it adds up to a coherent theory of how you tackle those three interconnected questions.
Daniela, you have argued, and you've really generated, at least on Twitter, an entire discourse around this argument. You've argued that these measures are fundamentally flawed and that they prioritize a narrow form of government intervention in the form of de-risking private investment. What is de-risking? In what way do these pieces of legislation de-risk? And why does that fail to get us to where we need to be in terms of reaching zero emissions and other related goals that Bidenomics purports to address, like goals like increasing union density and raising worker wages?
Thank you. Yes. Let me take a step back from de-risking and spell out how I think about Bidenomics as somebody who's a close observer, but from the outside of the U.S. domestic politics process. And I think about it in a two-step fashion, right? First, what does it displace? And there I agree with Tim and Ted that it does indeed displace trickle-down economics. It does displace a lack of political willingness to engage with questions of climate in the U.S. It displaces a lack of attention to questions of employment and of workers' rights. But then my second step is to think through what does it put in place. And that's where I think we have some disagreements, or we've had some disagreements with both team and Ted, and with a large part of the US progressive movement around Bidenomics, because I think what it puts in place is not as radical as it sounds. And I'm describing, so what I want to think about in answering this question is what kind of state-capital relationship does Bidenomics put in place when it brings the state back, okay? So if we agree the state is back, indeed, then we have to think, okay, what kind of relationship does it put in place? And that relationship I describe as de-risking. It's not a term that I came up with. It's a term that has been used by, particularly by private finance, to conceptualize the role of the state in mobilizing private capital for the energy transition in the global south. This is Deutsche Bank in 2011 and kind of a longer pedigree. So what de-risking to me means a relationship between state and capital that is still market-based, that puts capital in the driving seat, and that ultimately is a consequence and is constrained by a specific set of macrofinancial constraints that we operate under. And those two macrofinancial constraints, I'm sure you will get to them, have to do with the fact that we still live in financial capitalism and we still live under a architecture of macroeconomic policymaking that puts an independent central bank at the helm of macroeconomic policymaking and subordinates to some extent, although in the US there is now a more interesting relationship, but it subordinates fiscal policy to the needs of the specific priorities of inflation targeting. Now, why is this problematic? What is the general logic of de-risking that I think I would like, we'll hopefully unpack in broader terms? So de-risking is about mobilizing private investment, is to put it in the words of the Biden administration, is about crowding in private investment, not replacing it. And the techniques of crowding in basically amount, in my view, and having looked through most of the details of the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, this is very different, and this is where I also have some disagreements with Ted and Tim around bundling the CHIPS Act and the IRA Act together. I think there are very different kinds of state relationship with capital in the two. But the logic is you basically bribe private capital into the kind of public policy priorities that you do not think that you can achieve for reasons that have to do with macrofinancial constraints or reasons that have to do with the domestic political constraints, which I think are quite binding in the US. So that's my sort of broad overarching view. De-risking is a word or is a conceptual lens to think about the relationship between state and private capital that is created through the return of the state in climate politics and generally in industrial policy. It puts capital in the driving seat, and I'm sure we'll get to this. It is, to my mind, an inadequate script for the climate transition. We will not get the structural transformation that we need for alignment with the Paris targets under the framework of de-risking.
You argue that instead of this bribe to capital formation, de-risking, what we really need instead is a big green state. What is that? And what tools would a big green state wield as sticks to discipline capital, in contrast to what you're describing as the carrots that the de-risking state uses to bribe capital?
Very good. So in general, I think about the notion of bribing is also at the core of de-risking in the sense that the state absorbs some risks from private investments in order to make certain public policy priorities investable, right? And this is a logic that comes from, or an intuition that comes from a kind of very market-based place, in the sense that it diagnoses the lack of investment in certain sectors as a consequence of the wrong price signal or the wrong risk-return profile. So what the state does is to improve the risk-return profile, for example, through tax credits. Or it can be through tax credits, it can be through loan guarantees. There is a very broad range of de-risking measures, and they're not only fiscal, they can be regulatory. You can have all sorts of forms. For example, in Europe, we have feed-in tariffs as a regulation to encourage demand for renewable energies, or to, in a sense, force some demand for renewable energies. But there is a series of carrots that the state provides through in various forms, as guarantees, as tax credits, as loans on preferential terms. But because the logic is of partnerships for investability, there is no space for the state to introduce measures to discipline private capital into strategic priorities when market conditions change or when profitability conditions change. And that to me is something that the big green state can do, is to move away from the logic of the market signal. And how does it move away from the logic of the market signal? Is either through a much closer control of the pace and nature of private investment than what we're getting through de-risking, or through direct public ownership. So that's one very important aspect of the big green state, is a closer control of private investment. And the second one is a change in the in the relationship between the institutions of macroeconomic policy making, one where there is a closer coordination between the central bank and the treasury or the Ministry of Finance, to support industrial policy and to support a kind of more discipline-based approach to industrial policy.
Ted and Tim, what do you make of Daniela's argument? Are some of what Daniela characterizes as carrots, in your view, actually sticks?
I think there's a few angles that we could take at this. One of the questions to ask is sort of what progressive aims were encoded in the legislation. What did progressive organizations and forces bring into the debates and to the organizing and to the push around what became Bidenomics? So we can think about to what extent the legislation that was enacted encodes various progressive priorities or doesn't. I think it can be worthwhile to think about what parts of the IRA might not actually follow the de-risking logic that Daniela articulates, because I think there are some and they're important to understand. It's also probably worth talking about those things that are getting done through regulation, or that could get done through regulation outside of the framework of the legislation itself, that do encode certain disciplining logics potentially. It might be worth talking about parts of the legislation or parts of the overall legislative agenda that did encode a disciplining logic that did not make it into the final legislation. So, for example, one of the ones that I've focused on a lot in some of these Twitter debates is the Clean Energy Payments Program, which was a part of the legislation that was proposed that would have essentially mandated the full decarbonization of the power sector in the United States. It didn't happen, right? And we can talk about why it didn't happen.
Because of the balance of political forces.
Yeah, and I think it's worth getting specific about that, right? And then I think we could also talk about some of the reasons behind the why we ended up with this de-risking logic that might be defensible from a progressive point of view. And so here, thinking in particular, Tim has introduced to the discourse the idea of bottomless mimosas, but there was a real theory about how you get much more fiscal bang for your buck through the use of certain instrumentalities of the tax code that enabled you to do a much greater amount of climate spending than the Congressional Budget Office would score, which allowed you potentially maybe to sneak past some of the veto points that existed within the US political system at the time that many of us were working to get this legislation passed. So any of those angles are possible responses. And then broadly, right, I think we absolutely want to talk about what any and all of this says about the balance of forces, because ultimately I think that is the determining factor here, right? That is at some basic level why we get what we get. And we can think about whether we could have done better. And we can also think about what we can do given with what we've accomplished. But I do think that, just by way of starting it off, that there's obviously an immense amount of truth to what Daniela is saying, right? And the core idea that most of what's going to be accomplished is going to be accomplished by trying to, you could say push, or you could say coax, or you could say entice, or you could say bribe, but one way or another, try to redirect the flow of private investment towards what we have determined to be a set of socially or politically useful purposes. That is clearly the single most important mechanism at work in all of this legislation combined. And people are very explicit, right, that they ultimately expect the ratio of public investment, right, of direct public dollars being spent to private dollars. The amount of private money is supposed to be much bigger, right? And we can debate whether that should be or should not be, but that is without question the underlying logic. I don't think it's quite as extreme as some of what you see in the discussions about how you're going to get investment flowing to the global south, for example. where the ratios are just absolutely astronomical. But the underlying logic is, I think it's absolutely there. But so we should think about what that means.
When we talk about the balance of sort of political forces, like what explicitly do we mean? Like one way is that this entire Bidenomics legislative package had to make its way through Congress, and it's hemmed in by sort of three big forces inside the US Congress that are also there in other countries and jurisdictions like the EU. So one of those big ones is the power of the deficit hawks. These are people who don't want spending to be greater than the revenue. So every dollar of spending has to be backed by a dollar of taxpayer, of some entity that is going to be taxed. So that's the deficit hawks that are, people like Pelosi, people like Biden himself, people like Janet Yellen. These are really people who are monitoring public spending. And so we are still very much within the neoliberal sort of discipline of public spending, which is one reason why you can't do many things on the public balance sheet, because taxpayer dollars are politically expensive. They may not be expensive in any sort of MMT style or whatever, even a taxpayer dollar that is increasing the productive base of a country, increases tax revenue in the future, so it sort of pays for itself in future growth. So there's a lot of sort of stupidity and ideological constraints holding back public spending. So those are the deficit hawks. The second sort of big powerful group are China hawks, including in the administration themselves, who are driving a very aggressive China containment agenda, sort of taking the baton from Trump and carrying it much, much further. And so the China hawks are also constraining what can and cannot be done in the bill, what must be done. We've got to onshore chips, we've got to onshore solar panel manufacturing, we've got to be really careful about critical minerals, we've got to increase the Pentagon's budget to mount a two-front war, both in Europe and against Russia and against China. So China hawks, deficit hawks, and then the third extraordinarily powerful one are fossil capitalists. These are, let's call them the fossil hawks, but these are forces that have grown tremendously larger in the last 10 or 15 years. Under Obama, the United States Congress sort of gave a lot of support to building out the shale boom in the form of, shepherding a massive pipeline boom, a boom in the Appalachian Basin of oil and gas, a boom in the Permian Basin of oil and gas. And the United States by 2015 became the world's largest oil and gas producer. In 2015, the Republicans pushed to make sure that we lifted the crude oil export ban, and all of a sudden the United States goes for the first time in 40 years to starting to export crude oil, and from then natural gas. And literally in 2016, the United States exported 0 molecules of oil and gas. And by 2022, by the time this bill is being negotiated, the United States becomes the world's largest gas producer, gas exporter. So these fossil hawks are also really driving a policy agenda and removing these sticks on fossil fuels. And they get a huge shot in the arm after the Ukraine war as prices shoot up. And, the Biden people are reduced to calling it Putin inflation and trying to sort of really blame inflation on the rising oil and gas prices. But those rising oil and gas prices gave a huge boost to the oil and gas industry that literally said, open all the floodgates, give us all the permits. We want to expand oil and gas drilling to take advantage of these high prices. And so these bills that are formed, they are formed by that public spending limit. They're formed by anti-China, make in America sort of policies. And they're formed by a lot of carrots and no sticks at all to fossil capital.
Tim, can I just clarify? Because to me, the US CHIPS Act, it has some of what we know from the literature on successful industrial policy, particularly in East Asia. It has some of this kind of compulsive institutions that the state designs in order to monitor and kind of discipline capital into its strategic priorities. And I'm wondering, why was it that it was possible for the US to build some of these compulsive institutions into the US CHIPS Act, which for me is not a manifestation of a de-risking logic, but not in the IRA? Is it because the power of fossil capital worked differently in these two different spaces, and microchips maybe doesn't have the same kind of political concern for fossil fuel capital than it has for than the US IRA would have?
And also perhaps that the positive motivation of geoeconomic and geopolitical conflict with China, depressingly, seems to be the sort of motivation that can overcome almost any obstacle in American politics.
Just to say quickly, and Tim may have other thoughts, but I think one thing that's really important about chips is that it activated the corporate concentration anxiety on the left in a much more intense way than IRA did. IRA promised all sorts of capitalist interests, profitable or opportunities for profit making over a 5 and 10 and 20-year horizon, but not in a way that necessarily inflamed fears of intense and concentrated corporate welfare. But chips promised to funnel billions of dollars directly to 3 or 4 or 5 companies that are already massive companies that control that have massive market share within their respective sectors. And the Progressive Caucus was public about their efforts in this respect. But for example, things like the ban on stock buybacks in chips, which is not actually in the legislation itself, it was in the subsequent rulemaking that the Commerce Department undertook, was something that was fought for very explicitly by the Congressional Progressive Caucus on the theory that while we were all absolutely in favor of investments in US in science and technology and the semiconductor industry, and we all understood the need for resiliency in supply chains, and nobody wanted to repeat what had happened when US automakers canceled all their chips orders and suddenly we couldn't produce cars. Everybody agreed we didn't want to go back to that, but there was a real concern to make sure that this didn't just amount to a massive exercise in corporate welfare. And then obviously, I think, Dan, you're right. The sort of China hawk component of it also meant that some of the strictures in the CHIPS Act have to do with the ability of the companies that were benefiting from CHIPS Act money to engage in investment and research and other forms of economic activity in countries that were deemed to be a national security threat, which obviously everyone understood to be China. So both of those factors were very pitched in chips in a way that I think was a little bit more intense than we saw around the IRA debates.
Tim?
Yeah, I think the idea of are these subsidies just sort of corporate welfare? And, maybe the CHIPS Act was able to have a few more sort of constraints on good labor provisions and procurement from America, et cetera. But the IRA is more of a de-risking corporate welfare sort of thing. I don't think that's quite right, because it depends on what do we mean by sticks? Are these actual penalties? Okay, so the IRA doesn't have very many actual penalties, except for 2 big penalties that we should really talk about. Firstly, it's a tax bill. So it's going back to deficit hawks. They said you've got to make this into a tax bill that pays for the spending that you're about to put out. And we are going to calculate the spending. The Congressional Budget Office is going to score the bill and say it's got roughly $370 billion of spending via all of these tax credits. And therefore, they have to be matched by some revenue raisers, which is US sort of speak for taxes. And the Biden administration, right from the get-go in March of 2021, when they released the American Jobs Plan and the Families Plan, had an entire slew of measures of about $4.5 trillion of taxes that they were going to raise. And those taxes were basically reversing the Trump-era tax cuts on the Fortune 500 companies and installing a new tax on people who make more than $400,000, which was sort of Biden's promise that he's not going to raise taxes on anyone making less than that. But over the course of this sort of fighting of all of the corporate forces that don't want to be taxed, they just said, screw you, you aren't going to tax us. And so that $4.5 trillion goes into $2.5 trillion, $1.75 trillion in the House Build Back Better. And then the final bill is still a tax bill, but it's a much narrower, smaller tax bill, which puts a 15% corporate alternative minimum tax that puts about $200 billion of taxes. So that's a penalty on the tax avoiding sort of corporations, and it gives the IRS more money.
But sorry, Tim. But this is not a penalty, or it's not a stick that ensures the companies that are receiving subsidies are pursuing the industrial policy objectives of the government. I mean, it's a very broad.
It's a generally applicable tax.
It's exactly, to me, that is not a stick at all. The opposite.
Yeah, that's a general tax, and there's also a 1% tax on stock buybacks. Again, something that should have been in chips as well, but was in the IRA. But it is it's not an explicit penalty against the companies that are getting the money. It's a general tax measure.
Perhaps you could argue that it's a stick vis-a-vis capital in general, maybe, but not in terms of pursuing the particular industrial policy.
Yeah, but that still means that the IRS is and the U.S. Treasury behind it is the agency through which all of U.S. industrial policy is now going through. And the IRS has to have enough people and staff to monitor these tax credits, what I've been calling these bottomless mimosas, because they are uncapped, they're limitless. You just show up at the IRS bar and they give you a mimosa, and you go and you bring all of your friends back in, which is what progressives should be doing, so that more and more people go to the bar and the IRS keeps giving you mimosas. But that can easily turn into champagne for the rich without enough tax enforcement. It can easily turn into sort of carbon sludge. You just get a whole bunch of greenwashing firms that show up at the IRS door and say, hey, I've got a green project. And it's just carbon sludge. So bottomless mimosas is sort of a metaphor to capture this idea that this entire thing is happening at the IRS. And the IRS, without proper staffing, without proper enforcement, without monitoring, without clear rules, which the Treasury has been writing for the past 6 months, it just turns into a stickless corporate welfare.
So the stick is enforcing that people are actually following the strictures of the tax credits. Daniela.
I worry when progressives have to celebrate, well, as Tim says, that capital gets more resources, and we have to celebrate a distributional outcome that favors capital with very little meaningful sticks in place. I mean, I don't see, from where I stand and from the European experience of designing much more biting sticks, particularly to discipline fossil capital, the idea that your tax officers are going to be in charge of industrial policy, of green industrial policy, is on many levels a level of political wishful thinking and defending, to me, the politically pragmatic outcome that could be obtained in the US. But let's not confuse that for progressive distributional outcomes, or even for successful green industrial policy. Because I don't know when an IRS tax officer is going to say to Ford or to Tesla, your electric vehicles that you're producing are 3 times or getting larger and larger and are using more and more resources. And that's actually not what we need. What we need is, smaller electric cars and electric public transport. So I think we have to be careful, from where I stand, not to mistake, leaving behind a status quo that was clearly very much against any kind of progressive climate politics to a bottomless mimosas for private capital, which even unions in the US are questioning as not so much in favor of either creating skilled jobs or, the discourses of place that you heard earlier actually manifesting or generating the demand for skilled labor that unions would encourage. There are many examples that this is not the case. So I'm skeptical. I think a team has to come up with a better fight back against.
I would agree that we should be very skeptical and we need to be very involved in the monitoring and enforcement process, because this can really go off the rails. And exactly what you're saying, unions are upset. Like, this was supposed to create good paying union jobs, as the Biden administration keeps saying, but are they? Lee Harris of the American Prospect has reported on the solar jobs in the solar industry in Texas, etc. And they are currently pretty shitty jobs. Workers are hired through mainly temporary staffing contractors who have the discretion to fire them at a moment's notice. And then, they'll make them drive across the country on their own money to get to the job site. Harassment and abuse is completely rampant. These are just temporary gig work. They're not really careers. And rather than becoming sort of union electricians who can work in a variety of projects, these non-union workers are trained to be a new category of a worker, solar installer, which is a much narrower category. And, the Biden administration will say, yeah, but, we are using our discretion to encourage these higher labor standards and we're going to have more monitoring. But that's hard. And it's particularly even harder in the chip industry when, as Ted was saying, there's just 3 or 4 firms that are getting all of the money from TSMC to Intel. And so when you insist that, no, we need to have higher labor standards, that's going to get hard if there's just 3 or 4 companies that say you don't have any bargaining, negotiating leverage. TSMC is building a gigantic plant in Phoenix, Arizona, and they've refused to sign a project labor agreement with the local unions. And they've mostly employed non-union construction labor, and they're using out-of-state and overseas workers. Can the Biden administration actually use these enforcement mechanisms to get union jobs? They haven't even tried. TSMC has just announced that they'll be bringing in 500 new Taiwanese workers to finish building the plant because they say it's too hard to use local labor. And I really don't see the Department of Commerce, really using its muscle. It will have a lot of good words in the guidance. There are a lot of pro-worker goals in the guidance. But TSMC knows that it has the upper hand, that the US needs the TSMC more than the TSMC needs the US. And they can't play hardball.
Ted, it seems like a basic point of debate here isn't so much whether this new industrial policy and the IRA and the other legislation are beset by the contradictions and problems of neoliberal capitalism. It seems like there is some consensus on it, but it almost seems like the point of debate is what sort of terrain of struggle this represents and whether it is pointing us in any sort of promisingly new direction or not potentially, or whether it's totally captured by prior logics.
I think a couple of things that can maybe open that up a little bit. One thing just to say before we totally skip over the question, the one thing that the IRA included, which was not talked about much but is a big deal, is it included a fee on methane that was viciously fought by the fossil fuel industry and the oil and gas industry, but did end up going in there. That is a stick on fossil capital. It's not the biggest and most important one, but it is a meaningful one that shouldn't be left out of the discussion. I think one way to get at this might be to focus in on some specific provisions or on some specific sectors. I think Daniela brought us into the terrain of the auto industry, and I think it would be good to talk about that. One of the things that progressives, and this ended up mattering more in the power sector than the auto sector, but I'll come back to it. But one of the things that progressives really pushed for in the making of U.S. climate policy was that there should be, if not outright sticks, though we push for those, the carrot should encourage good behavior. And I do think if you look at the structure of the tax credits, there is a fair amount that you can point to in there that is worth lifting up as genuinely good. So, for example, and this is why much of the labor movement was genuinely enthusiastic about IRA as it came to be. So the basic clean energy tax credit, right, the investment tax credit, which is going to incentivize wind and solar, geothermal, other things. The structure of it is that just building those things, you can take a 6% federal tax credit, just off the top, right, of the cost of installing that power generation equipment. If you use prevailing wage, right, if you pay prevailing wage in your construction of that wind facility or those solar panels or whatever, that baseline credit goes from 6% to 30%. And so that 30%, the differential between the 6 and the 30, that 24% differential, is larger than the pay differential between paying prevailing wage and paying whatever the wage would be in the local labor market otherwise. And so that is a very significant incentive for people who are building clean energy generation to pay prevailing wage. And paying prevailing wage is a really big deal for especially building trades unions, right? It doesn't guarantee union organization, not by any stretch, but it very significantly levels the playing field between non-union and union labor such that there's a shot of organizing. And it takes some of the pressure off the unionized sector to have to make concessions to contractors when they are able to get union contracts, project labor agreements, so on and so forth. There's the energy communities provision, right, which gives an additional bonus tax credit for locating generation in certain places that were heavily dependent on the fossil economy or that suffered the consequences of locating fossil production and activities in a geographic area. There's a low income bump. There's a whole bunch of things in there that do encourage private investors to do certain things a certain way. There's been a lot of talk on Twitter. People know about direct pay, right? So one of the things that progressives, I think, rightly count as a big win in IRA is that now for the first time, public and nonprofit entities can receive these tax credits basically just as a cash payment, even though they themselves have no tax liability. And so what it means is that municipal governments, for example, can get in on the clean energy game in a way that they were structurally excluded from before. So there's the opportunity to create actual public ownership through that provision. But
this was crucial to the feasibility of New York's recently passed Build Public Renewables Act, correct?
Absolutely, right. The sort of dug-in opposition of the New York Power Authority and the New York State governor that switched to basic openness was a function of realizing that thanks to direct pay, they could tap into a massive amount of direct federal funding to build renewables themselves, which previously had been quite complicated from a legal and financial point of view to do. Just to come to autos, because I think there's a lot that we could look at there. There were some major progressive goals that were brought into the initial debates about how to structure an industrial policy for the auto industry. Everybody agreed that the one key component of decarbonizing the U.S. economy is decarbonizing autos, right? There were things that people wanted to do to create, let's say, the highest road pathway forward for that, on the assumption that we were not ever looking at building a publicly owned competitor to car manufacturers. We could talk about whether we should have, but I can promise you that was never on the table. So as long as we were going to continue in a world of private production of automobiles, what were people trying to do? Well, the Biden people initially had an idea that there would be a union bump on the EV tax credit. I believe it was $4,000 or maybe $5,000 on top of the $7,500 general EV credit. And that would go to any EV that was made in a union facility. And this was meant to be an explicit bonus or incentive or advantage to the unionized auto sector mostly in the northern Midwest, and a disadvantage, relatively speaking, to the foreign automakers and also non-union U.S. owned automakers that mostly produce in right-to-work states in the U.S.
In the South in particular.
In the South in particular. This was, of course, viciously opposed by the foreign automakers. It was viciously opposed by the EU itself, which actively lobbied against it. It was viciously opposed by both Canada and Mexico, who, within the context of the free trade area, the North American free trade area, thought that they would be significantly disadvantaged by this. And it was opposed by Joe Manchin, who anticipated EV production locating in West Virginia. It assumed that it would be foreign non-union EV production and didn't want to see those investments disadvantaged. So the union bump, which a lot of people advocated for, was slashed. There were, nevertheless, still some important provisions, right, in terms of making this more progressive. So, and some of them, frankly, ought to be credited to Joe Manchin himself. So Joe Manchin was very upset about the idea that very rich people would be getting the EV subsidies. And so he pushed for an income cap on the households that could tap into this tax credit. So households over $300,000 couldn't get the tax credit. Manchin also pushed for a used EV tax credit so that people who are buying used cars could actually get some incentive from the federal government. So in a funny way, Manchin worked in some more progressive elements to that overall regime. But there were then some really, I think, significant shortcomings that people in the administration didn't like and that the auto unions didn't like. So, for example, those adder structure that exists in the clean energy tax credit really don't exist in the manufacturing tax credits at all. So there's very little in the law on the manufacturing tax credit side where IRS money is going to automakers for clean manufacturing that encourages prevailing wage or that encourages any particular kinds of labor standards. We were not successful in encoding those sorts of standards into a lot of those tax credits. And Daniela has drawn attention to this, and the UAW has drawn attention to this. One of the big pieces of the IRA is the funding for the Department of Energy and its loan programs office. This is another largely sort of a mechanism that evades some of the fiscal hawks because the actual fiscal scoring of the money that goes to the loan program office is much smaller than the actual lending that they're going to undertake. there's very little in the law that attaches explicit labor standards or other things like that to the lending that the loan program office is doing. That said, at the same time, there are many, I think, well-meaning administrators and others within the Biden administration who are trying to figure out, within the constraints of the law, within the constraints of the reconciliation process, which is how we got this through Congress, which makes it really difficult to attach regulations to any spending. How can the deals that are being negotiated with individual firms encode labor standards? And I think you can point to some places where they've been very successful. The Bluebird union campaign is one of them. Some places where they've been unsuccessful. And just the last thing I'll say is that it is important, I think, to keep in view the regulatory processes that are playing out simultaneously. So in the case of autos, right, the EPA issued new tailpipe regulations. Now, some people think they're not strict enough, but that is absolutely a form of discipline, right? It is going to make it basically illegal for automakers to produce certain lines of internal combustion engines over time, or prohibitively expensive for them to do so. And so there is a stick component, which involves no money, of forcing the industry to transition to a different production profile in order to achieve decarbonization goals. And although that's not in the legislation, I do think it ought to be considered part of the overall package.
I want to get a little deeper into first labor, then decarbonization, then public ownership. Ted, you made some really important points here around the labor provisions that were initially proposed and then ultimately not included, and then a lot of things that are being worked out on the terrain of the administrative state. And it really is sort of like a split screen situation with labor and the IRA. Because on the one hand, you have this recent huge win by the steelworkers at Bluebird's electric bus factory in Georgia, which unionized thanks in some significant part, I think, to the EPA's rule for their clean school bus program that recipients of funds must agree to union neutrality and barring the use of federal funds for anti-union activity, something that the steelworkers use to their advantage. But as keeps being referred to, as a quick aside, that's a very notable union victory in Southern manufacturing. But then on the other hand, the UAW just released a lengthy video statement from the new left-aligned militant leadership of their union attacking this energy department plan to lend $9 million to this Ford-SK joint venture to build 3 battery plants with no labor strings attached, which is part of this more general concern that we're hearing from the UAW that the move to EVs will accelerate rather than reverse the decline of union density in auto manufacturing. What sort of terrain of struggle has Bidenomics created for labor? And where does the self-activity of workers, of unions that are more militant and more ready to strike, fit into how this all plays out on the new terrain, to the extent that it is a new terrain, which might be part of the debate?
If I may go first, just because I wanted to respond to some of the points Ted made, and I will forget them. So I think, if I listen to Ted's arguments around how the Biden administration has built certain carrots into the provisions of the IRA in order to ensure better labor rights or better pay. And these carrots are quite significant. 24% tax credit is a lot more than 6%. And I mean, it sounds very persuasive, and I think this is one of the difficulties with the Biden administration, that it has a kind of outside layer, like an onion, of progressive politics that can be enabled or not, but with a core of very hardcore pro-capital distributional politics. And I would be really curious to know, but I haven't seen the data, to what extent are the announced IRA private investments, like what percentage is really following or really using the 24% tax credit? I mean, is the way to get to get better distributional outcomes for labor is the way through de-risking? Is it really possible that bribing to bribe private capital into making working conditions better for labor? I have some doubts about that, but I also know, being in Europe, that our trade unions, which are in general, I would say, stronger, at least on the continent, not in the new UK, our trade unions were looking very enviously at the Biden administration process of working with unions, saying, in Europe, nobody involves us in the same extent. So there is a kind of little bit of a paradox for me here, because on the one hand, you can look at the glass half full and say, well, this is the best that could be done given the very specific politics that Ted outlined. But if you look at the glass half empty, in the end, this process leaves at the discretion of private capital the extent to which they will adopt certain labor rules that could be mandated. A big green state could say you have to have this level of wages if you don't want to come under very strict provisions for decarbonization. And that's a regulation. It doesn't use the price signal. It just says this is what you need to do in order for you to stay in business. And I, as a state, have the right to mandate that. But this is not what is happening. What is happening is you get 24% tax credits if you include certain better conditions for workers within your whatever new factory or new EV plant.
And Ted, I would add to that whether the glass is half full or half empty probably also depends on what corner of the labor movement you're looking at that glass from, whether you're looking at it from the building trades, which seem to have made out pretty well under the IRA, or the UAW from the manufacturing side, where there's a lot less leverage provided by the IRA in terms of unionizing the workers, not the workers who are building the manufacturing facilities, but the workers who are working to do the manufacturing once the facilities are built.
I think the question about what is the terrain of labor struggle post the main Bidenomics legislative package is a really interesting one, and we could probably approach it from a couple of different angles. But if we stick on the auto sector for a second, at a global level, right, and this could take us into another realm of controversies, right? The IRA does absolutely encode some things that you could call protectionist that create a really significant incentive to locate production of all aspects of the auto supply chain in the United States, or at least in North America, right? So that's the critical minerals provisions within the batteries, that's the assembly requirements, and all these are connected to the ability to access the manufacturing tax credits and the ability for consumers to access the point of sale consumer tax credits when they purchase an EV. And those have been the source of immense controversy, right, in terms of the U.S.'s trading partners and allies and what have you. And we can talk about the carve-outs that have been made and whether that vitiates it or not. But in any event, there's going to be a lot more auto manufacturing in the United States. I think it's pretty safe to say, thanks to the IRA, and a lot of the EV supply chain that might otherwise have been located elsewhere is going to be located in the United States. So to the extent that you have trapped, in a sense, private capital in the United States, if they want to be able to access these very significant financial incentives, from a global perspective, you would say that ought to be helpful to the project of increasing union density in the auto sector. It should, all things equal, reduce the threat of offshoring that has hung over so much of auto unionism for the past 40 or 50 years. Not just offshoring, but also, probably even more importantly, the movement of production from union to non-union states. So at that level, you should imagine there's going to be a lot of demand for autos. There's going to be a lot of production of autos in the U.S. That all things equal creates some leverage for auto workers to be able to organize. On the other hand, certainly what we've been seeing, right, is that the absence of some of the big green state type provisions that Daniela is talking about means that a lot of the investment in the EV supply chain is happening in right to work states. And some states, I think Georgia has probably been the most sophisticated and aggressive in its policy of working to attract those investments, are really, militantly anti-union places, right? That are absolutely going to fight any beachheads of the UAW or other industrial unions with every tool at their disposal. I mean, many of us watched before EVs, right? Many of us watched what happened even when the Volkswagen workers were able to get Volkswagen to agree to neutrality at a union election in Tennessee, and the state of Tennessee and all the elected officials in the state started going on television to mount a massive anti-union campaign motivated by the fear that the liberal Obama supporting UAW was going to get a beachhead in the right to work South. So
they threatened to retaliate against the company if they agreed to neutrality.
Right. Well, I think the company, yes, exactly. They threatened to take away all the local tax incentives that they had offered if the company went along with this. So I think nothing about the IRA, right, stops the anti-union forces in the anti-union parts of America from using every single tool at their disposal to fight unionization. And I think, Brian Kemp is, again, probably the most sophisticated player in this because he's trying to assimilate all of the federal money to what will look to the outside like a classic sort of Southern economic development strategy, which is explicitly anti-union. But I guess I just think that even in the absence of IRA, right, there was going to be growth of the EV sector. There was going to be continued enticements for companies to want it, to the extent that they were going to locate in the US at all, to locate in right-to-work states. And the path forward for organizing that sector was going to be treacherous. It's very hard for me to see how we're in a worse position in terms of the class struggle within the auto sector post IRA than we were before it. And so I completely understand Sean Fain, criticizing the Biden administration for a $9 billion loan to Ford and their joint venture partner that seems to have very few strings attached. But I also think that's probably just part of the way that these fights are going to play out. The UAW has got to figure out a strategy for getting in there and organizing those workers. They'll find, I think, so long as you have Biden administration in Washington, they'll find that they've got a supportive NLRB that's willing to, really go after companies for unfair labor practices. They'll find public support in the form of the things that the president and others will say. And they'll find that we continue to operate in a legal terrain that is extremely favorable to capital in any capital labor struggle. Last thing I'll say, Dan, I believe you've had episodes about this on your show, but, one of the things that people tried to put into Bidenomics, into the overall package, was the PRO Act, right? The Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which would have substantially increased penalties on employers for a variety of anti-labor, anti-union practices, which would have made illegal certain core, union avoidance strategies. And we couldn't win it, right? The votes were not there to force that through in reconciliation. And so, significant change to U.S. labor law is not one of the things that was a part of the Bidenomics package, even though the administration and probably, 85 to 90% of congressional Democrats pretty ardently supported it.
Tim?
If I could just, Ted made a really good point about the auto sector is extremely globalized. So it's not something that can be done with just domestic U.S. Congress support. So if we are trying to increase unionization and let's say U.S. Democratic Caucus supports it, but if the Europeans and the South Koreans don't support it, it could still die. So, Manchin was heavily lobbied by Toyota and Tesla that had non-union factories in the state of West Virginia. And the story that Ted was talking about, the European ambassadors literally wrote a letter to Schumer and Pelosi in October or November 2021 saying, kill the pro-union provisions because our factories, our European car company factories are in non-union states. And their industry association independently also lobbied to kill these. So the auto sector is uniquely globalized. And post the IRA and, I really thought the Europeans were just operating in bad faith because they said this line of criticism of, we didn't know about all of your domestic content and final assembly packages. And they do a freak out in September, October, November after the bill passes last year. But they were already lobbying to kill the bill or kill the pro-union provisions in the bill in 2021. So I thought it was largely in bad faith. And the question of are the European firms excessively corporatist and in bed with the EU to sort of not do pro-union stuff and pro-union stuff at home or in the US? Are they just sort of using the US non-union states as a base to manufacture vehicles? That's just on the EV side. And on the domestic side, the opponents of unionization aren't just the right-to-work states, but also the entire crew of people that came together on the domestic progressive side to push for a childcare, to push for 3 to 4-year-olds getting pre-K, and a lot of sort of care jobs for elder care, which is what SEIU, this Service Employees Union, was pushing for. That entire set of provisions in the bill was chopped out. Now, was it chopped out because these jobs are largely done by lower paid, browner, blacker, largely women workers that have not been sort of strong, that have never been traditionally unionized. And this was sort of a push, maybe a once in a generation push to win unionization in this sector of the economy. And we sort of lost it, and we just don't get the chance again. The whole sort of like who is actually trying to kill unionization, I don't think can be put just at inside the Democratic caucus for the international pressure that comes to bear, and then within the Democratic caucus, sort of which parts, which sectors, the care work versus the manufacturing versus the construction unions actually get the benefit is up in the air.
Daniela, do you want to respond before I ask my next question?
Yes, just to note that, I mean, it is right. I would never say that European private capital is somehow more altruistic or more union inclined than the US private capital. And I'm not surprised at the level of lobbying. I think there is an interesting kind of geopolitical angle to discuss, because the de-risking as a strategy to kind of energize or scale up the energy transition in particular has been used by European countries for longer than the Biden administration has made it like a cornerstone of their policy. And that, to my mind, also reminds us that de-risking or the green capitalist state is by necessity of political and macro-financial forces, of structural forces, is by necessity a de-risking state. So yes, European private capital has fought very, very hard at home as well to make sure that it minimizes the impact or the kind of progressive disposition of the return of the state in industrial policy or through climate policy. That is not a specific kind of US dimension. What is interesting to me, and maybe we'll come to this, is why Europeans activated all their misgivings when the US started doing large-scale de-risking of the climate transition, but not when China did it. China has done this for much longer, and in many ways, Europeans were much more relaxed about creating markets for Chinese solar manufacturing than they were about creating markets for US solar or car manufacturing. And that has to do something with the geopolitical tensions within what we think is the North Alliance rather than otherwise.
Deindustrialization, the battering of the American working class and unions, regional inequality, I think that all really gets us to the real theory of politics behind the IRA and Bidenomics more generally. And my read is that Bidenomics recognizes historically that the New Deal order created a material basis for a mass political constituency for New Deal coalition politics, namely through unionization and thus labor receiving this historically high share of national income. And it recognizes that neoliberalism, which the Biden administration refers to, I think, pretty consistently as trickle-down economics. I think that's their code word for neoliberalism, that it's geographically uneven and extremely unequal distribution of income, that this created a material basis for Trumpism, for reactionary populism and authoritarianism. How does Bidenomics propose to create a new material basis for liberal democratic politics? And then returning to the debate we've been having, does that theory seem likely to succeed on the ground? Because will it succeed if these jobs don't end up getting unionized? Or alternately, if they're heading to red states in the Sun Belt where people, let's say even it becomes like a really great economic situation for people there getting these new jobs, hypothetically, they just won't give Biden and the Democrats credit for it. Are they creating a material basis for this new sort of politics? Is it even possible to do so in today's United States?
And can I just start very briefly, and under the provision that I'm an economist who doesn't have a very good theory of politics, so I would let others get into it. But I would just say that from the discussion that we've had so far, particularly from Ted and Tim, my takeaway is that like neoliberalism, Bidenomics kind of presents workers with the same choice of either you're excluded or exploited. So it doesn't seem to me that it really kind of amplifies or creates a terrain for some really radical reorganization. And as a European who lives in a country and who was born in a country where the state played a much more important role in the public provision of public goods, I think as a US worker, I'm not sure how much of a change would I see in my daily life from the US IRA, except maybe that my job, I mean, the concerns of what you call militant unions, what I think is just regular unions in our corner of the world. The concern is, I mean, if we get worse jobs, a lot of the fiscal resources directly into profits for private capital, and we get the same financialization of public goods that we've had so far. I mean, what is at stake here, or what is it that we're really getting? And I'm not claiming to have an answer, but I don't know that the answer is very straightforward. Everything will be better.
Tim, Ted?
I think it's worth looking at the full package of Bidenomics. So we talked about this sort of activist legislative push to put federal dollars in the left behind areas and left behind communities, making sure that, non-college educated people are getting a lot of these jobs. But there's also the sort of the macroeconomic component of Bidenomics, at least before inflation rates were, dramatic. Inflation rates went up from 2021 onwards. The whole idea was that we are going to increase union density through our legislative push, but we're also going to structurally improve the bargaining conditions for labor, because the bargaining power of workers goes way up if the government is actively trying to run a full employment and is committed to full employment sort of macroeconomic policy. So, Biden in a big speech, in, I think, the budget speech in 2021, he says, instead of workers competing with each other for jobs that are scarce, we want employers to compete with each other to attract work. We want companies to try and attract workers with higher wages. So that's their sort of push to, yes, we can't perhaps increase union density in specific sectors, but we are going to increase or reduce the pool of unemployed workers, and that reduces a company's sort of bargaining power. And when you have that kind of competition, then workers can move to places with higher wages. And, that was complemented by during the CARES package and the ARP, sort of larger and more generous unemployment insurance of $400 per unemployed worker per week. And that therefore allowed people to leave shitty jobs, especially in the retail sectors, and move to sort of higher productivity, higher value added, better, safer, more stable jobs. So in that sense, they've tried to at least increase employment. So, at this point we have, I think the lowest unemployment rate in about 30 or 40 years. It's under 3% or just around there. And that is a structural improvement for labor.
Ted?
I think there's a couple of different theories that you hear articulated, and there's two in particular that sometimes get collapsed, but are actually distinct. And to be honest, I don't know which one the Biden people actually subscribe to. But so one theory is that it is a theory of Democratic Party majorities, right? So you deliver investments, you deliver jobs. The Democratic-controlled federal government is seen to be the author of those investments and those jobs. People credit Democratic policymaking with improvements in their lives, and they vote for Democrats. Another theory is almost in a sense the political opposite of that, which is about locking in the policy, but not necessarily focusing on the electoral outcomes. And so there, the idea is that whether or not red state voters or red district voters continue to vote for Republicans, the flow of benefits and investment into those districts, right, and those states will make it extremely awkward for Republican elected officials to try to cut off the flow of funds, right? Because they will have created beneficiaries. And there's a broader thing here that goes to Daniela's core point about de-risking, which I think is actually, I don't know how explicit we on the left were about this at the time, but I think you don't have to scratch very, very far below the surface to get to this basic idea, which is that we always thought that climate policy required the building up of a green capital sector that would be able to exercise political power at least partially to offset the power of fossil capital within within U.S. political economy. I mean, and here's where the U.S. Europe, maybe the single biggest difference between the U.S. and Europe when it comes to political economy of climate, right, is, as Tim said at the outset, the U.S. is the biggest fossil fuel producer in the world. Our fossil fuel lobby is absolutely gigantic, and so I think even people on the left understood that part of what was going to happen if we were going to lock in climate policy was that you were going to grow some green capital sectors that were then going to become advocates for it. And so then you get into the political economy, the sort of geographic political economy of that, right? Which is that you need, as U.S. defense spending has mastered over many decades, right? You need beneficiaries in every single congressional district in the country. So you'll see Biden people or Biden adjacent people celebrating the fact that some of the biggest investments have gone to some of the, not just red, but the reddest districts, right? Which have absolutely no hope of flipping. But I think the idea is that it'll be difficult to undo what's been done in future administration. I'll say I was personally surprised by the extent to which the Republicans prioritize completely gutting the IRA in their debt ceiling standoff bill. Now, how much of that was just they're trying to score political points? And when we get to a world where Republicans are actually governing, like, do they go at it with the same ferocity, or do they have misgivings as they don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg or whatever? I don't know, but there's definitely that wager. And it just to be clear, right? Those are two very different logics. The logic of lock in the policy regardless of what happens with the politics, and the logic of build the electoral majority that can sustain it. And I really do think that they sometimes think both, and they haven't necessarily decided which one is actually driving the strategy.
And what's your assessment as to whether either of those strategies will work?
I think it remains to be seen. I mean, one thing I have definitely, I'm just in my own work doing a lot to try to figure out how we implement the IRA on the ground in ways that will be really visible to people. I've been doing a lot of work around the buildings sector, right? And how we go about the process of decarbonizing people's homes, right? And there is money in the IRA for that. There's various programs in the IRA for that. Some are better than others. And it does seem to me like it is going to be a very complicated proposition to the extent to which people experience anything that's happening in their own homes, in their communities, in their neighborhoods as something that is a function of these exercises in policymaking. Like, there's a naive theory about how that works, which I think is probably not correct. But there may be versions of it which are just blunt force and could have a big impact. So, for example, I'm thinking of as part of the CHIPS Act, one of the big investments is Micron, the semiconductor company, is going to be building a massive facility outside of Syracuse, New York. I've heard estimates of, I mean, obviously it's company propaganda, so take it with a grain of salt, but, over 20 years, they're going to pour something like $50 billion into the Syracuse area. There may be something like 10,000 jobs when, all in. And in Syracuse is a city of 100 and change thousand people. It's absolutely, a place that was massively hit by deindustrialization, especially in the 2000s. Is that going to be seen as a federal investment that changes the life conditions of that community as a whole? That's a very contested congressional district. Does it affect the marginal voters' decision about how to vote? I think that could be, we could look at that as a kind of bellwether about at least that version of the theory.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I'm skeptical as to whether, or at least to what extent, you can build a new material basis for a new Democratic majority just through investment. I think if we look back to the New Deal period, it wasn't just objective economic growth or rising wages. It was also the prevalence of unions, these intermediary organizations that helped people make collective political sense of the economic situation. And so I think it does rest on this investment question, but also on the unionization question, which we've been discussing and depends on Bidenomics, but also on all these other factors.
And those weren't the only institutions, right? Rural electric co-ops, right? For example, right? I mean, a lot of rural America was solidly Democratic for several generations. And that was in part both the investments and the institutional fabric that was created by some of the New Deal interventions. So, but I absolutely take your point.
Daniela.
If I can just respond to this theory that if you build up green capital, particularly in states that are Republican, then you create some political lock-in. And I think the experience of Spain, I was just reading this morning a post on the experience of Spain with de-risking solar industries in the early 2000s, or late 1990s, early 2000s. And I think it was driven by the same logic, right? So you had feed-in tariffs, which is a form of de-risking that guarantees a certain price. And the consequence of that was the conditions for de-risking and for the carrots for private investment were so attractive that Spain found itself with a kind of disorderly expansion of green solar capital. And as the political cycle turned and a new government came in, what they did was to basically reduce the amount of carrots that were given to the solar industry, and that led basically to a crash. So in a future where a new administration might reduce, and I don't know to what extent this is possible, but in the future where the carrots are reassigned or redesigned because the macrofinancial constraints and the politics of those constraints change, then we might see exactly what happened in Spain in the early 2000s and what threatens to happen again, because Spain is going back to trying to become a solar powerhouse, given some of the fiscal space that the Next Generation EU and other kind of common European fiscal resources are creating. But that is, to me, the problem of relying on building political coalitions is through de-risking, is that they are also vulnerable to changes in politics. I understand that the alternatives are even more politically difficult to construct, but the experience that we have in Europe of using this kind of de-risking approaches to building private solar capital can very quickly run into fiscal constraints.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Travelers of the World Revolution, A Global History of the Communist International by Brigitte Studa. The Communist International was the first organized attempt to bring about worldwide revolution and left a lasting mark on 20th century history. The book offers a new and fascinating account of this transnational organization founded in 1919 by Lenin and Trotsky and dissolved by Stalin in 1943, telling the story through the eyes of the activists who became its professional revolutionaries. Studa follows such figures as Willy Munzenberg, Mikhail Borodin, M.N. Roy, and Evelyn Trent, Tina Modotti, Agnes Smedley, and many others less well known as they are dispatched to the successive political hotspots of the 1920s and 30s, from revolutionary Berlin to Baku, from Shanghai to Spain, from Nazi Germany to Stalin's Moscow. It traces their journeys from revolutionary hope to accommodation, defeat, or death, looking at questions of motivation and commitment, agency and negotiation, of life and love, conflict and frustration. Travelers of the World Revolution, A Global History of the Communist International by Brigitte Studa, out now from Verso Books. We keep touching on fossil capital and the rollout of green energy, which we've been focusing so much on in this discussion, of course, is only half the energy transition. We must also just stop burning fossil fuels as soon as possible. But the Biden administration, including through the IRA, has in many cases ramped up fossil fuel production. What are the Bidenomics tools, if any, to deal with ramping down, ending fossil fuel production? Tim?
So we've had a shale boom for the last 15 years. It started out in 2008, and it has dramatically changed the United States from being a net energy consumer to a net energy producer and exporter. And inside the shale boom, there's this big fight between the big boys and the small fry that are called sort of the wildcatters. And the wildcatters, largely in the Permian Basin, elsewhere, as soon as energy prices would go up, they would start producing more and more and would bring energy prices down into what was called the shale band of roughly $40 a barrel to $70 a barrel. So if it went above 70, they would start overproducing more and they would start bringing the price back down. So as soon as the Ukraine invasion happens, and actually as soon as we have like a huge crash with COVID, the industry just kind of reorganizes, and the small fry sort of get gobbled up by the big fish. And that really meant that from then on, when oil prices rose, production doesn't go up. So this is the first time that has really happened over the course of the shale boom. So we had this crazy period where the Biden administration was very worried before the midterms last year that they would lose the midterms because of energy price inflation, gas prices at the pump going up. And they run around begging the industry to increase production. And the industry basically says, no thanks. Like, we want to earn some money. We want to take all the cash that we are earning and plow it back into dividends for our shareholders and not put it into new production. And that's because the industry structure had changed during COVID. And so we now have a much more consolidated industry where the big majors share the interests of sort of not preventing production from going up in line with prices. And they are earning much fatter profits as a result. And within the US, a lot of progressives tried to push for an energy windfall tax after the war began, that we should take some of these excess profits and we should use that, we should tax them away from the energy companies and put it into renewables, put it into free buses, put it into sort of some things that consumers can see lowering their energy bills or green appliances that they could be given, et cetera, et cetera. And the industry just fought back. And, you need 50 Senate votes for a new tax, and you just simply couldn't get those. Whereas in other countries, particularly in Europe, the Italian government, the UK government, a bunch of other places actually did pass an energy windfall tax, a penalty against fossil fuel producers. And I just found it, really remarkable that if we just had a few more votes inside the Senate, maybe the United States could have passed a big profits windfall tax and at least tried to take away some of those fossil fuel profits, which are now basically being plowed into sort of political dollars to further entrench the oil and gas industry.
Daniela?
I want maybe again to disagree with Tim on how we understand the sticks or penalties, because to me, a windfall tax on excessive profits in the oil industry following the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not a penalty in the way that the European decarbonization model had envisaged penalties. And I want to bring here, I want to also stress a bit what I think are some of the negative externalities of Bidenomics that have emphasized carrots so much for the domestic politics reasons we have explored. But in Europe, before Bidenomics, we had an approach starting from around 2017, 2018, that explicitly wanted to combine carrots for sustainable activities with sticks or to discipline and penalize fossil capital, particularly through central banks. And I want to bring central banks in, not just because they're my favorite, policy actors. And we rarely mention them when we talk about industrial policy, although the macroeconomic implications of what central banks do have a significant bearing on, the pace of green industrial policy. And so what the European central banks, both the Bank of England and the European and the ECB had done in this before Bidenomics is to say, we need the state to take active steps to shrink certain sectors. We cannot wait for this logic of de-risking, where you make private renewable energy more attractive, more investable, and then, fossil fuels will simply the market process will push them out. No, in Europe, we had central banks designing frameworks to penalize dirty capital. We had a sustainable finance taxonomy that the European Commission put in place to differentiate between, at least to first identify what were green activities, and then we were supposed to have a dirty taxonomy that would identify dirty activities. And the European Central Bank had a climate strategy that said climate is within our mandate of price stability, because, climate crisis can have financial stability aspects, but also because what the financial sector does it can amplify the climate crisis by lending to fossil fuels. And there was a very sophisticated framework that it's still there, although it's kind of completely been emptied of any meaningful action since Bidenomics became such a strong political force outside the US. And the logic was, if you have fossil fuel bonds that you hold in your portfolio as a financial entity, we will penalize the holding of these bonds. And you can structure those penalties in a way that both signal to markets that the price of dirty credit should be much higher than it is. And also you completely eliminate from your monetary policy operations the subsidies to carbon credit. And in Europe, we had, I don't know whether this is something that you hear in US policy debates or in US central banking debates, but in Europe, we had central bankers saying that monetary policy provides subsidies to dirty fuels, to fossil fuels, to dirty activities, and this should stop. And it is the responsibility of the state to stop it by imposing penalties to shrink the sector. This is very revolutionary for central banks that usually don't want to intervene or don't want to be seen as intervening in the allocation of capital. But that's what we had from very conservative central banks 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So to me, I think the question of the relationship with fossil capital is not only how powerful fossil capital is, although it turned out to be very powerful, also how powerful the financial capital behind it can be, because BlackRock was lobbying so heavily the European Commission and the ECB that we all knew about it. It was, usually lobbying activities, you have to be a TED or a team to have worked very closely to work out all the lobbying details, not an academic like myself, but we all knew about BlackRock because it was really panicking that the European states, through their central banks, were all of a sudden developing, this muscle that said, I don't want any capital or very little capital there, and I'm going to use my powers as the state to stop it from going there, to make it a lot more expensive. So yes, this is to me the place we were.
Daniela, a quick follow-up question. How did Bidenomics disrupt that trend in European policy making that you just described? And did it just cause them to prioritize competition and seeking a share for European companies of the emerging green tech market?
I read it as Bidenomics provided the political backing and more momentum to the lobbyists opposing the penalty-based climate regulation in Europe, because every company that, not only fossil fuels, but companies that would come under some penalties for their dirty activities, they could go to Brussels or to the national capital and say, oh, you know what, guys, we're moving to the US. Look at what the amount of carrots they're giving us, where you're all here dishing sticks through regulation. So what you heard we heard in Brussels or in Berlin or in Frankfurt concerns about, what is the US IRA going to mean? It's not only private capital that spoke, through the voices of state officials, but to some extent it was also a concern that it is much more difficult politically to stay on course with a much stronger decarbonization framework that penalizes private capital when everybody is shouting that it will just move to the US, which I think is what happened.
So they were in the process of being disciplined, and then they pointed to the US and said, hey, we want bottomless mimosas too.
Yes, yeah, we was like, why is the US opening a bar and you are giving us sticks, basically. And then the Europeans said, well, we'll not open a bar because the Germans don't like bars, but at least we won't do the sticks anymore. So we are in the worst of all worlds. We have no bottomless mimosa and we have no sticks. Or no discipline.
Tim?
Just one on kind of fossil fuel subsidies, right? So fossil fuel subsidies, because most of energy comes from fossil fuels, almost like they just receive the lion's share of subsidies. So when we are talking about, companies not getting enough sort of green tax credits in Europe, what they got instead was a massive amount of energy subsidies, because the European energy shock was much, much larger than the American energy shock, right? So Europe was spending about 12% of its GDP compared to before the war, around 2 or 3% of its GDP on energy. And that massive amount of spending was largely done by the government doing deficit spending to put money into companies' pockets and into people's pockets to lower and defray their energy bills. And when you added it all up across the countries in Europe, it came up to more than 800 billion euros of subsidies largely towards fossil fuel, because that's just the structure of the energy market, 800 billion euros of subsidy in 1 year, right? If you add up all of the congressional spending from the IRA, that amounts to, according to the CBO, about $40 billion a year, or about $400 billion for the decade. So the US is dishing out subsidies, the bottomless mimosas of about 40 billion a year. The Europeans are dishing out 800 billion euros in 1 calendar year, largely for fossil fuels, largely to the companies and to households. And so in that sense, like, the amount of subsidies being pushed out, because of the blowback or the backlash from the war was enormous. And that's one of the reasons why in Europe, they basically tried to switch from any more stakes or any more regulations towards a new carrot-based approach, because they are now really reckoning with the fact that the fossil fuel system is extremely expensive for the government and for households and for everybody else. And the amount of blowback that comes, the political blowback that comes as societies boil with these high prices, the government just has to step in and give more subsidies.
Can I just jump in? I think the geopolitics of energy are a really important thing to understand in relationship to Bidenomics and to all the things that we've been talking about. So, I think that in 2020, when Biden was running for president, and in early 2021, when they were initially laying out their legislative priorities, their agenda, there was a lot that was intended to discipline the fossil sector, right? I mean, there were very explicit commitments about, no new leases. There were explicit commitments about eliminating all manner of fossil fuel subsidies. They were probably not ever imagining actually shutting down existing production. But again, I mentioned the Clean Energy Payments Program. That more or less would have made it so prohibitively expensive for the power sector to burn fossil fuels that it would have shut down many coal plants and even natural gas plants across the country. That very little of that remains, right? Come 2022, 2023. And part of that is Manchin, who is dug in his opposition to anything that will threaten fossil interests from the start. He is, after all, one of the only Democratic senators who represents a fossil heavy state. Not the only one, but probably the one whose state depends most heavily on fossil for employment and tax revenue. But then it also is affected by the Ukraine war but in some paradoxical ways. So on the one hand, some of the things that Tim mentioned in terms of how the Biden administration suddenly, in the context of inflation, especially energy price inflation, is desperate to see more oil, especially oil, but also gas getting produced to bring down prices. And so to not have to suffer the political blowback from inflation. But also it affects Manchin's thinking in ways that don't often get discussed. But he's pretty clear in the summer of 2022 that the Ukraine war actually pushes him to ultimately support what becomes the IRA. And the reason is a logic of energy security. So the exposure of the US economy and the energy sector in particular to price shocks driven by geopolitical developments elsewhere in the world leads him to the perspective of we need, all in, right? We need all of the above energy strategy. And that includes various inducements to the continued production and even expansion of fossil fuels. So he negotiates some real nasty things in the IRA, right? Probably the nastiest provision in the whole bill may be the piece that ties new leases on public lands and waters of renewables to new leases on public lands and waters of fossil exploration. And so he gets those in there. He gets his pipeline stuff in this side deal. But he also says, yes, we absolutely need a massive rollout of clean energy, because that also is part of our overall energy security strategy. And at least from what I see, it's not clear that Manchin ever would have gotten to yes on the clean energy parts of it, if not for the shock to U.S. energy markets that happens in the early part of 2022 in response to the Ukraine war. So in that sense, the geopolitical developments have a huge impact, but also in paradoxical and maybe to some extent in quite unpredictable ways.
I want to talk about where public ownership fits into this all, both in terms of Bidenomics and then where does it fit in your/our vision. Melanie Brusler writes, quote, "Private asset ownership and market coordination cannot perform the synchronized dance of investment and divestment, nor bear the cost of maintaining excess capacity." And, quote, "A boom in private renewable projects will not on its own orchestrate a planned build-out. Even with subsidization, private actors are still only likely to invest in sufficiently profitable projects, not coherent, system-wide renewable build-out. Why is public ownership important, not just in terms of it being a part of the principle of economic democracy that we all believe in, but why is it important concretely for achieving decarbonization and a just energy transition? And then are there ways that all these carrots and sticks, or carrots versus sticks that we've been discussing, that they can be deployed in such a way that puts us on a path towards socializing a growing share of this capital, a way to publicly coordinate private capital, since we live under capitalism, that moves us down the path to more public ownership?
I mean, I think it's a really incredibly important question. For better or for worse, I think it wasn't one that was super front of mind for most people when the agenda of Bidenomics was taking shape, and not just among the people in the administration and in Congress, but among progressives and in the sort of broader left progressive organizational ecosystem. Not that people didn't desire it, but it wasn't necessarily the thing that people put as the must have. I think the obvious part of the IRA that maybe can contribute to public ownership is the direct pay provisions that we mentioned earlier, which and I think we're seeing a lot of local and state officials around the country starting to become aware of that opportunity and getting really interested in how can they take advantage of it, and how can they take advantage of it not just to own a couple of assets, but also to create institutions that can engage in the building of more of those assets over time. I think that's one of the exciting kind of post-IRA terrains of struggle for us is, on the left is working to build those institutions in that capacity and to increase the role of public ownership. To your broader question about its necessity, I mean, yeah, I think that Melanie's piece is excellent and puts the problem really well. It's clear that you need to deliver benefits to people to build a political coalition for decarbonization. And it seems pretty clear to me, at least, that the way you do that is mostly on the so-called demand side of things, right? Increasing the attractiveness of clean energy and of electrification and of other things like that, showing the benefits in terms of cleaner air, in terms of lower utility prices, in terms of upgraded and more efficient equipment, all those sorts of things, in terms of jobs, obviously. But that alone is not going to move us on the sort of timeline that we need to. There's Paris goals, but there's the reality of the acceleration of the climate crisis. And it seems pretty hard to fathom that without the public balance sheet playing a really aggressive role, that we're going to be able to tackle things like the exposure of so many communities across the country to increased flood risk and what that does to insurance markets and what that does to home prices, much less that we're going to be able to gradually, ultimately over time, decommission much of the fossil infrastructure that we have in this country and around the world. And if you assume, as I do, that that's basically inevitable, that at some point down the road, those things have to happen, there's a version of it where the public just ends up absorbing everything as those companies go bankrupt, as homeowners lose their shirts, and it's just picking up the mess in the worst kind of de-risking kind of way, which is the literal socialization of all the losses, right? Or there may be ways to do it more proactively that cost less, that are more equitable in various ways, that are less random and less reactive. And it's pretty hard to imagine doing that without the public sector in a much more assertive, much more directive role. And whether that requires ownership explicitly or sticks of a more aggressive sort of the types that Daniela has talked about, I assume that there's a range of those things, of those types of practices and sort of instrumentalities that we'll ultimately need, but we're going to need more than what we've got right now.
Daniela?
The Commonwealth, where Melanie is now, has another report that makes, I think, a persuasive case even for fiscal hawks, the kind of fiscal hawks that are kind of circling everywhere, not just in the US, but here in the UK or in Europe. There is a persuasive case that public ownership, particularly of in the energy sector, is cheaper than de-risking private energy or private renewables, and we've seen that in the UK, where we have a very significant share of of renewable energy through contracts for difference, created through contracts for difference and other kind of de-risking arrangements. And we still had very significant price shocks and a cost of living crisis that in part reflected very high fossil fuel prices linked to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there is a kind of short-term fiscal hawk case to be made for public ownership, and then there is the long-term orderly transition and orderly decarbonization case to be made, not just for public ownership, but for a wholesale change in the macro-financial regime that we have. So I don't think public ownership is enough. I think it's necessary. I think it's politically very difficult at the moment. But we also need a change in the way that we think about the state's balance sheet, where the state will have to, by necessity, will have to have a much larger balance sheet that it has at the moment. And for that, it will need a central bank that works with a very different logic of coordination with the state. That includes also, and that is a necessity, I think, also because we have to remind ourselves that we need to shrink certain sectors. And what we have at the moment, in my view, is a disorderly expansion in both green capital and fossil capital for the reasons that Ted explained that are linked to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what we don't have enough of is building institutional capacity for the state to either discipline private capital into climate strategies, or to organize itself, right? Because this is something that we haven't discussed yet. But I am wondering what happens when, the political conditions are right for a big green state. Who will do it?
Right.
You need
Capacity.
a lot of technocratic capacity for that to happen. It doesn't come out of nowhere. And under what conditions can you have such a large financial system, a globalized financial system, with a kind of exposures on their balance sheet that will generate stranded assets? I mean, this is a much broader conversation to me about can we pool a nationalization of certain pension funds like some governments that I will not name in Europe for political reasons have done. I mean, it's very big. It's not just, one. If we have a publicly owned energy company in New York, will everything kind of all of a sudden fall into place? I think the wholesale rethink of the reorganization of our macro-financial architecture is very necessary, and politically I cannot think that is possible at the moment, but who knows what the world looks like in 5 years from now.
Yeah, I'll just make one quick point on public ownership, which is we already have a lot of control. By we, I mean the public has a lot of control over the energy sector, which has been right from the start has been seen as something that needs to be stable and orderly and cheap and affordable, because if it gets disrupted, it disrupts not just consumers, but industries and the entire sort of social and political order in some sense if energy becomes too expensive. And so we regulate the prices and we regulate the electric utility industry via a public commission that's set up, a rate-setting commission that allows companies a certain profit margin, but in return, they have to agree to a particular price. And the public literally has to sort of give a check off to the types of capital investments they're allowed to do in any 5 or 10 year period to keep expanding generation or renewable assets. So in that sense, that we already have a framework around which the public gets a say in price setting. Even if we don't do the full public ownership, these are extremely important places for public pressure and political pressure to be brought to bear on the public utility commissions. And then on the sort of the broader macro financial sort of ways in which we can reduce prices and have price ceilings and floors, we do that, for instance, with government bonds, right? The government is the biggest purchaser and the seller and the issuer of bonds. So it maintains price ceilings and price floors in many places. And similarly for energy, when Biden says he's going to use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to unload oil and gas to prevent prices from going up too high, that's a huge publicly owned cave in Texas that is filled with oil and is stored there. And when prices go up, we inject brine into the cave and lift up the oil and dump it into the world market. So these are ways in which the public owns significant pieces or has very many tools to control prices and is heavily involved in the energy sector. And I think what public ownership means is bringing all of these tools in one institution rather than locking them away in these separate siloed places that are then vulnerable to capture by industry under a controlled energy transition.
Can I just add? In this paper that kind of informs some of the arguments that I've made around the Bidenomics as de-risking. I also talk about the use of monetary de-risking by central banks to intervene in government bond markets to basically preserve their investability for private finance. I would say that, Tim, maybe that's where we kind of disagree, because at the moment I don't see any central bank except for the Bank of Japan, who is a very special case and it's not the time to discuss it here. But no other central bank is explicitly controlling or fixing prices. It's just making sure that in moments of tension, the liquidity stays there and is there for investors to not run away. So we do have some architecture of de-risking that could be scaled up but into something more of a state-led decarbonization or supporting a very extended public ownership and a much larger, bigger green state. But at the moment, that is just an architecture that is used for de-risking purposes. I think I'm very clear on that. And I'm bracketing Japan for a lot of reasons here.
Tim, do you want a brief response?
Yeah, I think it is largely in crises. And when it comes in crises, it's largely used to just put a floor under prices so that they don't go too down. And there's no ceiling mechanism. So prices keep rising, private sector keeps getting most of the gains of those assets, but the public sector comes in to put a floor. And this is not well. It's not there in non-crises use.
Let's talk in some detail about China and what many, of course, are calling a new Cold War, with Bidenomics seeking to deny certain advanced semiconductor technology to China, create battery supply chains that exclude China-sourced components and critical minerals, and just more generally to check China's economic development and military power. Jake Sullivan, in this much noted speech he just gave on the new Washington Consensus, he described this new approach with China as a departure from the globalization optimist assumption that, quote, bringing countries into the rules-based order would incentivize them to adhere to the rules, which seems like he's talking about Thomas Friedman's argument that that no two countries with a McDonald's had gone to war with each other. But what's the real U.S. problem with China? Because it seems that it's not illiberalism or authoritarianism. Saudi Arabia and Israel, after all, both have McDonald's, and their behavior doesn't really bother the U.S. The concern, again, is China. Why that concern, and when did China become perceived as so threatening? When did it become such a bipartisan norm to perceive China's rise as an almost existential threat to the U.S.? And then lastly, and Daniela, you mentioned this earlier, what sort of state is China? Because the U.S. has justified its new model by arguing that China wasn't playing by the rules, so we need kind of to make new rules that will let the U.S. compete with China. Is China a de-risking state? Is it a big green state, or something else entirely?
I like how you put the question. What's the real China problem? So first thing I think is important to note is that, and you see this in all the speeches, right? There is a very significant element of self-critique among the policymaking elite when it comes to how they talk about China. And it is along these lines that there was this optimism. The theory variously went under various names, but a popular one was convergence, right? That as China was integrated into the global economic order, most sort of significantly through its accession to the World Trade Organization, which was finalized in 2001, as China liberalized in economic terms, that its political system would also open up and it would also liberalize. And there's different reasons around this. Our friends Jake Werner and Toby Chow, for example, argue that was actually happening for a period of time in the 2000s and early 2010s. I think there's debates about that, but in any event, that was the theory. And the U.S. believed, therefore, that China could be integrated as a node in the global economy that remained fully subordinate to the U.S. in geopolitical terms. Just as, after World War II, Japan and Germany were integrated into a U.S.-led global order in which they variously competed with the U.S. economically, but were fully subordinate to it militarily and geopolitically. And I think that there's a self-critique that runs on two levels. So the one on the economic level, you really can't overstate the significance of the China shock literature on the thinking of these people. They cite it by name in a way that you just never.
David Autor is cited.
Yeah. They cite it by name in a way you never see policymakers cite academic literature. But these are the most mainstream of mainstream economists, right? Labor economists who documented pretty powerfully. I don't know, not everyone's convinced, but powerfully that the opening to China starting in 2001 did in fact decimate American manufacturing. That it was very geographically specific, right? And then in a short paper that I don't know that they ever actually followed up on, right after the 2016 election, they showed that those counties and those metropolitan statistical areas that had seen the heaviest import penetration from China were also places that seemed to flip towards the Republicans. So there was a sense that the opening up to China had much more significant domestic economic consequences than anybody had anticipated in the 90s and early 2000s when this was being done. And that it had then political consequences, that there was a direct correlation and causative effect between that and Trumpism. The other thing is that, by their lights, China becomes much more assertive geopolitically and militarily. People date it to different moments. Some people say, immediately in the wake of the 2008 crisis, as the US seems rather hobbled by the collapse of the housing market, whereas China pulls off this, frankly, world historic stimulus program, mass building program, and the investment of the Chinese state actually basically floats the entire world economy for about a decade. So some people see it connected to the immediate post-crisis moment. Some people see it to more the moment at which Xi Jinping consolidates power within the Chinese political system and seems to author a new, much more statist economic policy, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, the practices of, there are quite easily documented instances of economic coercion where China decides to punish other countries whose diplomatic maneuvers China doesn't like with certain economic measures, boycotts and the like. So there's a perception across the US political elite, certainly by, I would say, 2018, that something has changed in China, and the theory that China would, quote unquote, converge into this, harmoniously into this US-led economic order was just comprehensively discarded. And once it was discarded, they really flipped on a dime, right? And they went from seeing China as potentially a benign partner to active threat. And the last thing I would say is that, so China poses I think there are genuine conflicts of interest between the US and China when you look at things like Taiwan and the broader sort of, East Asia security questions and questions of military alliances and so on and so forth. But the other piece that's really important for them, and this connects back to climate, is that they watched, by 2021, people had woken up in the United States to the realization that China was absolutely dominant in key manufacturing sectors. So, right, for a long time, people thought China, they only do the low-end assembly stuff, but all the cutting edge, all the industries of the future, all the high value-added stuff is still located in the global north and especially in the US. But suddenly China controls 90% of markets for solar panels and basically the entire solar supply chains. It controls the critical minerals, dominates the battery supply chain. And all of a sudden, the US, the policymaking elite, realizes that we are going to have this energy transition one way or another. There is going to be a massive replacement of machines across the globe. And they're really freaked out that China is going to absolutely dominate all of those industries and all of those future markets. And so they have a problem with China, I think, in that they want the US and European countries, although they've gotten there slower, they want some of those industries to be located in their own countries, producing for their domestic markets, but also competing with China in what they anticipate to be the booming export markets of the future.
Daniela?
I just want to, I think this is, to my mind, a very convincing analysis of why the US or how the dynamics of the changing US-China relationship, and in particular the realization of US elites that China's very clever industrial strategy, particularly in clean tech, was basically threatening to displace the hegemonic position of the US. But I would say in Europe, there is also, I want to emphasize that there is also an ideological dimension to it, or there was an ideological dimension to the extent that Europe had faced this same concern for longer, because in the 2000s we saw various solar industries in Germany or in Spain affected quite significantly by the Chinese state's ability to scale up manufacturing of clean tech. And the response used to be, it doesn't matter because in the end, what we want is the market to work. So there was some commitment to globalization ideologically that was powerful, and it is still powerful in some European corners. And if you look, for example, at the recent attempts to mimic and emulate Bidenomics in the European Union, the framework is markets used to work well, but then the massive Chinese industrial policy is distorting market signals in clean tech, and therefore we have to do the distortions ourselves because there is no other way to square that circle, and we can both not compete with China on market basis, and we cannot, for energy security reasons, we cannot afford to basically allow this imports of Chinese technology. And you see that China, to some extent, is starting to retaliate on clean tech. Whether this will, how this will evolve, I'm not quite sure. On the question of the way in which China managed to get there, I think there are a couple of academics working on it, and maybe one day they will be cited by the U.S. administrations. But for the moment, there is a combination of big green state and de-risking there, because the Chinese state and the internal market is as such that you can scale up lots of things and you can play with lots of things in ways that are not possible in smaller countries. But just to remind ourselves that the European model in general for prioritizing cheap solar, there was also the very material point that there were lots of European companies in China. So it's not, the Chinese state doesn't in isolation kind of erupt on the international scene and threaten US hegemony, but there were very significant profits to be made by being located in China for a very long time, and many European and US corporations defended that arrangement, which they cannot do now for reasons that I'm not an expert in. But let's remember that it's not just a story of nation states. It's also a story of global capitalism, globalization, and financial globalization here. This is what I wanted to say.
Ho-Fung Hung, in his more recent book about China, makes an argument about how it was China acting less favorably to U.S.-based corporations that caused American corporations to secede from the pro-China coalition, thus allowing for this decisive shift in U.S. policy. Anyhow, but what should we make of the role played by this new Cold War, if we're indeed living through one? What should we make of its key role in motivating this new U.S. green industrial policy? Because during the Trump years, I recall that Green New Deal advocates were really pushing for a wartime style level of mobilization, but definitely without an actual war. Is it indeed rather depressing that ultimately geopolitical competition, simultaneously economic and military, that's veering dangerously close to armed conflict, that it's this motive that is proven to be so essential for the anti-war, anti-imperialist, internationalist left? What sort of terrain of struggle does this render, this new industrial policy, given the really serious, though still, frankly, incomprehensible threat of outright war? And then lastly, if one exists, what might a stable geoeconomic and geopolitical settlement with China, what might that look like? And then we'll go to the global south.
I would say I would not use the word depressing. I would use the word disquieting. It should trouble us very deeply, is how I would begin. And I don't think we can overlook it. I do think there is a tendency among some progressive forces to want to see this aspect of it as somehow ancillary in some way, that you could preserve everything else and somehow discard that portion of it. And I'm not sure that's true, precisely because it does seem to me that the whole shift in the U.S. elite in terms of their attitudes towards China is one of the preconditions for everything that we've seen. And I don't know what that means for us in terms of strategy, except that we've got to be incredibly focused on these dynamics and focused on the ways in which industrial policy tools might get deployed to ratchet up tensions in the international economy and in particular in geostrategic and military terms. And we should oppose forcefully and forthrightly escalatory moves. I do think it is important to oppose the semiconductor export bans. I think it is important to criticize them. I don't think that those in particular were an indispensable part of the overall package. They certainly weren't part of the legislation. None of the forces that came together to pass the legislation signed off on them necessarily, but they are an extension of it. They are clearly part of the overall strategy that the drivers of the U.S. state and U.S. military and U.S. diplomatic apparatuses are pursuing. So, I think that on the left we are not as read up on these topics and these new dimensions of, you could say, inter-imperial struggle as we have been on the way that U.S. global power manifested itself in the 2000s, for example. And so we've got catching up to do in order to be able to, oppose certain moves that are genuinely dangerous. And then the other thing I would say is that I think we need to, we really need to start thinking very intentionally about, some writers have referred to this as order building. It doesn't seem to me that a particularly propitious direction for the left to take is necessarily to sort of stand in a position of negation of US power. I just don't think there's a very big audience for that. And so instead, what we need to be talking about is the institutional architecture of international relations, of international security, of international cooperation around development and finance and all sorts of other issues. And what we should be pushing for is that one simply can't imagine a security order or an economic order or a political order globally that does not grant China a very significant place, right? There are 1.4 billion people in China, and it has the second largest economy in the world. And so coexistence has to be the name of the game, and we have to work to develop institutional frameworks that can sustain that on the baseline conviction that war would be an absolute apocalyptic endpoint that we have to do everything in our human power to avoid.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there's a particular logic underpinning how. So let's say you're convinced that the Chinese need to be contained. If you're a part of this U.S. elite sort of policymaking circuit that is convinced of this diagnosis, they have a particular sort of model of how to do that, of how to contain China, and they say, okay, the first element is it's technology that is driving China's economic growth and its military sort of catch up. And then the second element is China doesn't really know how to make and innovate new technology. They copy, acquire, steal it from us. So those are sort of their two premises of how do they need to sort of contain China, which is why the containment of China is taking the form of preventing access to high-end technology. So when Jake Sullivan talks about these kind of high walls around a narrow garden, these narrow technologies are chips and AI and biotech and a few critical minerals, because they are somehow convinced that if China got access to these technologies, then it would become richer and more powerful. I'm not so sure if that's even the engine of Chinese economic growth and security. If it is indeed sort of high-end technology, you could argue it has had a lot of sort of manufacturing catch up from just sort of applying the technologies of the second industrial revolution to a larger and larger set of provinces, going from the coast further inland into a logistics development, into a real estate boom, etc., etc. It's not clear to me that technology is actually driving their economic growth. And then the second premise that you can easily contest is it actually true that China's sort of know-how is not endogenous, that they are really copying and acquiring and stealing? There may be some of that, but they've been investing in R&D like mad for the last 10 or 15 years. They've had a huge, tens of thousands of engineers and scientists and doctors trained in, the MITs and Stanfords of the world. And they are as close to the technological frontier in many sectors, if not further from us. And in that sense, China's know-how is endogenous. You could remove these technologies from them. You could tell skilled chip manufacturing firms not to give them contracts. You could literally take the brains of engineers and tell them, get out of China. And they could still innovate and produce endogenously within their own country and catch up and create those technological engines of future growth. So even if you believed in we have to contain China, it's unclear to me if this is a way of succeeding. And obviously, it has massive risks of backlash to us. It could drive away American allies. It could slow down innovation. It could slow down climate investments. It could increase the prices of many goods and create sort of inflation for us. So this technological decoupling is an extremely broad, aggressive, and probably the most significant sort of step that the US is taking. And it's not clear if it's going to succeed on its own terms.
Daniela?
Also, so besides these arguments about the visions of the US elites relative to a powerful China, I also want to consider the possibility that, China is kind of a strawman or a useful Trojan horse for a crisis of capital accumulation that provides a way out of this crisis of capital accumulation, because then you can reimagine a state that is engaged in climate politics, even in countries like the US. You can build an infrastructure or an architecture of de-risking that becomes bigger and bigger, and then, creates profit opportunities for private capital. And you need a strawman, or you need an adversary for those political forces to come together. And China is very handy in the sense that it poses a serious threat to US hegemony. So it is functional also. The Chinese threat as a political narrative is also functional for global capital as a way to try to escape a crisis of capital accumulation. My only worry is that this planet doesn't care about the China-US conflict, and we are the acceleration of extreme climate events is throwing into very sharp relief what I think is a crisis of elite thinking. We really don't have the kind of political elites and the institutional space to imagine very radical alternatives that are better suited to keep us all on this planet. So I don't know. I mean, I recognize that it's important for the China threat is important in the US, but also I think maybe one step above that is to think about, capitalist accumulation.
The climate crisis is, of course, like the capitalist world system as a whole, it's fundamentally global in scope. Does the IRA point toward any sort of more internationalist approach to fighting climate change, or will the IRA and Bidenomics in general, does it point towards a world system that will continue to relegate the third world to being pillaged for primary goods? In this case, in the case of the green energy transition, goods like lithium and cobalt that are required for things like batteries, all while denying the global south the tech and capital that they need to develop and to develop on green terms. In that new Washington consensus speech that Jake Sullivan gave recently, he invoked the specter of a lithium or cobalt OPEC as a real bad possibility that the Biden administration wanted to avoid. He said, quote, "Clean energy supply chains are at risk of being weaponized in the same way as oil in the 1970s, which is about China, but it's also just not a good sign for how the Biden administration is thinking about cooperation with the global south in terms of the energy transition." What do you all think?
Yeah, no, I think that there is a line. So the IRA doesn't have anything explicit for countries in the developing world, right? There's no transfer of American taxpayer dollars going to countries there. It doesn't give cheap money. It doesn't try and reform the IMF or the World Bank. All of those are being done, but they're being done in other arenas, not directly in the bill that was passed. And in fact, American, progressives and the Biden administration make the argument that anything that the US does to accelerate production of green goods will make them cheaper by going down the cost curve. And once they are cheaper, the US can then export them to developing countries in the same way that China has made these green goods cheap and affordable for many countries to meet their renewable targets by purchasing Chinese-made batteries and solar panels and so on. They can do this now with American goods. And if that's the case, then you have to do a particular policy agenda. Then you have to try and control the IP rents that these companies are going to take from intellectual property that would otherwise make these goods unaffordable. So if you've driven down the cost curve domestically, how do they actually go abroad in the next 4 to 8 years? is a big open question, and that if progressives win again and if Biden wins again in 2024, that should be something that they can do. But I think the broader problem is just that, going back to that, this bill is being constrained by fiscal hawks and deficit hawks. It's not clear to me that, forget the Europeans that are constrained by these made up kind of ideological rules around the debt break. Well, it's not ideological, it's a legal rule in the German constitution, or sort of a legal rule of the Maastricht Treaty in the European constitution, where they simply can't do deficit spending unless they change these fundamental rules stopping them from doing it. The rest of the developing countries have a much narrower fiscal space, so they have much smaller tax bases from which they could give out these tax subsidies. And their fiscal space is also very constrained by, the amount of dollars that they have, the balance of payments that they have, and the sort of structurally much higher interest rates that they pay to bondholders and to banks. So if you're committed to a global energy transition, you would have to find means of changing the global trading order and allowing green goods to flow without IP rents and flow frictionlessly. You'd have to reform the IMF and the World Bank to make the cost of financing cheaper, and to tell the IMF and World Bank not to police the debt to GDP ratio of developing countries, which is what constrains their public spending. And you could imagine a green progressive administration saying those things to the IMF and World Bank. Hey, let countries increase green spending. It's fine if their deficits balloon, as long as it is for climate or pandemic or health or whatever progressive reasons. But that's not been the Biden administration's international agenda. Or if it is, they say we can't do these things because we are very constrained by a Republican Congress.
Daniela, what's your take? And this is not just a matter of global justice, though that should be enough, though it never has been. It's just a matter of the raw economics of doing a green energy transition at the global scale that it has to happen. Because if the global South is not provided with an economically viable path to do green development, why would they stop burning coal?
Yeah, I think where I find the progressive rhetorics of the Biden administration at its thinnest, is in this rhetoric of a new Washington consensus for the countries in the global South. And behind that, I find what we had on your show before, Dan, this idea of the Wall Street consensus is very much hardwired in there. And the idea that what the global South countries need is basically to mobilize private finance in this kind of from billions to trillions agenda that Ted referred to earlier. This idea that you blend a little bit of public money with a lot of private finance, and all of a sudden you get investment in all sorts of, both in the energy transition, but in all sorts of public goods. So the same logic of de-risking has been there in the Wall Street consensus well before the Biden administration or Bidenomics, and it hasn't changed at all in my view. I don't see any change, and I think if you see the rhetorics, for example, I looked at Brian Deese, who used to be the architect, or is viewed as one of the architects of Bidenomics, and his idea is that, and his rhetoric is that, isn't it great that our massive tax credit and massive de-risking for green hydrogen, for example, will constitute or will turn into cheaper energy technologies for countries in the global South. But we have to remember that countries in the global South, during their developmental stage, and even now, looking at the rhetorics of industrial policy in the global North, they don't want to become consumer of cheap clean tech. They can already do that with China. And this is one of the greatest ironies that I see, is that the US is protesting the fact that they are a consumer of cheap renewable or cheap clean tech from China, and that's not okay. That requires a whole geopolitical reordering, but the countries in the global South should be happy with this state of fact. The logic there is these are export markets. These are markets also that have to be as much as possible delinked from China and the Belt and Road kind of initiative. And we will not do anything different, but just scale up the rhetoric of this is better for you. I don't see much significant institutional change. The Biden administration is not supporting a mandatory involvement of private creditors in the debt-ridden countries in the global south at all. Not that I have seen. The Biden administration is not pushing for more grants or for more concessional finance to go into public goods. And the Biden administration so far I have not seen talking about technology transfers in a way that China did technology transfers. So I keep using this example of this Ugandan state-owned company that was going to produce and has started to produce, I don't know how much it's scaled up, but has started to produce electric buses for public transport with Chinese technology. Now, this is what technology transfer looks like in a revamped post-neoliberal, post-trickle-down economics, one that says we need manufacturing capacity and we need institutional capacity and state capacity for strategic industrial upgrading for countries in the global south. This does not exist in the Biden administration actual policies towards the global south. Everything in there, if you look closely, is based on de-risking. So I don't think there is much at stake there except for green extractivism. And even there, I'm not sure, because how is a green hydrogen project in Namibia going to compete with the massive subsidies in green hydrogen that the Biden administration is offering? Even the Europeans are now threatening to with retaliation through the WTO, because the set of carrots for green hydrogen through the US IRA are going to reduce the cost of production to $2 per kilo, as I understand. If those costs of production, I don't know who can compete on green hydrogen except China. So I don't see much promise in this empty rhetoric of the New Washington Consensus.
Ted?
The only thing I would say, and Tim has written about this somewhat extensively, I wrote an entire dissertation about a similar dynamic that played out in the world in the 1930s. But to the extent that things do change or will change, it seems to me likely driven by geopolitical developments much more than any enlightenment on the part of the U.S. governing or financial apparatus. I mean, the politics of foreign aid, just to put a really broad term on it, are difficult under the best of circumstances. But, I think what you've seen in some of the packages that have been negotiated, for example, with Indonesia, they do involve aspects of technology transfer, but it's coerced, right? The U.S. is making concessions to the extent that they are because they are seeking the geopolitical alignment of certain well-positioned or strategically positioned states. And we're likely to see, as we saw in the Cold War, to some extent we saw even in the 1930s, right, a sort of geopolitical gradient of the favorability or unfavorability of deals for relating to international development, finance, technology transfer, whatever, where states that have the capacity and the leverage and the positioning to be able to draw down greater amounts of resources, technical know-how, et cetera, will succeed in doing so. The double-edged sword quality of that is that it is all feeding into the escalatory dynamics that we are seeing in the world economy and in geopolitics. So it's hard to know how one should feel about it ethically. On the one hand, credit to any state that can negotiate better terms and do more for its own development, but we should all be fearful of the dynamic whereby there's a competitive sort of tit for tat aspect of that, which is all about buying geostrategic alignment for an ultimate confrontation.
Well, Daniela, Gabor, Ted Fertik, and Tim Sahay, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Daniela Gabor is professor of economics and macrofinance at University of the West of England, Bristol. She studies development, money, and debt through a critical macrofinance lens. Ted Fertik is a historian and the senior strategist for policy and research at the Working Families Party. All opinions expressed are his own. Tim Sahay is the editor of The Polycrisis, a publication in partnership with Phenomenal World, focusing on the domestic and international political economy of climate. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that things are only settled by the continuous struggle between capital and labor, the capitalist constantly tending to reduce wages to their physical minimum and to extend the working day to its physical maximum, while the working man constantly presses in the opposite direction. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. We are recorded at WBRU in Providence. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Tamuz Frankel and Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it is on iTunes, you can also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is spreading the word to your friends. Please make propaganda for us. And please do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.